Vivien Leigh's life was described in many ways: mad, wild, passionate, and brilliant. Her love affair with the great Laurence Olivier is one of the most storied and heartbreaking of all time, and her performances came through with all of the power of someone who had experienced some of the darkest suffering a human being can go through. It took a very special chemistry to create Vivien Leigh, a mixture of refinement, beauty, and intelligence that is rarely seen. But such a mixture is always volatile, and her explosive personality and extremely scandalous behavior have also come to define her, as has her powerful sexuality. Her husband once said, "After you've been to bed with Vivien, nothing else matters." But when it comes to Leigh, so many things about her truly matter. This is the story of one of Hollywood's darkest stars, the beautiful but tragic Vivien Leigh. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. As you likely know already, Vivien Leigh became world famous for playing not one, but two Southern belles. On top of that, she managed to do this with a convincing accent, even though her normal speaking voice was very much an educated English accent. But she was neither born in England nor in the United States. She was, however, born near a plantation, but one that produced tea instead of cotton. Vivien Mary Hartley was born on November 5, 1913, in Darjeeling, India, at St. Paul's all-boys boarding school. Her parents had moved there that summer to escape the powerful heat of Uttarakhand, India, where her father, Ernest Hartley, worked. Ernest was a stockbroker and an officer in Britain's Indian cavalry during the final days of the British Empire. Vivien inherited her dark, enigmatic looks from her mother. Gertrude Hartley claimed to be Irish, but records suggest one of Vivien's parents, likely her mother, was in fact of mixed heritage. Her mother, Vivien's grandmother, was possibly Parsi Indian, or a mix of Parsi Indian and Armenian. This could explain Vivien's dark hair and distinctive cat-like eyes. Whatever the truth, her mother's life was one of real tragedy. Gertrude's parents were slaughtered during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and she grew up in an orphanage. When she married Ernest in London in 1912, Gertrude would have known she needed to hide her heritage due to the era's racial prejudices. There's another possible reason for Vivien's striking appearance, and it's a tale that came from her mother. Gertrude believed that staring at the beautiful Himalayan mountains during her pregnancy would make her child just as beautiful. Whether it was legend or just maternal instinct, Vivien indeed turned out to be exceptionally beautiful. The Hartleys adored their baby girl and wanted to give her the best in life. When they returned to Uttarakhand, they hired a top Indian nanny to care for her. Vivien's nursery was as fine as any in Britain, and she was becoming more confident as she developed. At 3 years old, she performed Little Bo Peep for her mother's amateur theater group. She had her first ever audience, and from here she would grow to love performing. Vivien later described her childhood as idyllic. She even apologized to the press for not having a more dramatic backstory. "I'm sorry it isn't a better Cinderella story. I wasn't a poor girl, and didn't even have the commonplace experience of being opposed by stern parents. Father was a stockbroker in India, and I was born there. When I began longing to go on the stage, he and mother gave me every opportunity. They sent me to dramatic school in Paris, to Bavaria, and to London's Royal Academy of Dramatic Art." Gertrude had always intended to send her daughter back to England for schooling once she was old enough. Being a devout Catholic, she envisioned a strict education for her daughter at a convent. At first, it seemed that the ongoing First World War might delay their return. However, the war concluded just in time for Vivien, then 6 years old, to start her schooling at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in southwest London. At school, Vivien was the youngest pupil and, as described by a schoolmate, was cosseted and pampered by the nuns. Thanks to this, she was also allowed privileges like keeping a kitten in her room because the sisters felt sorry for the lonely little girl. Another reason for the attention she received was her beauty. Her looks made life smoother even at that young age. Lady Patricia Quinn, a fellow student, remembered her vividly. "I can see her now, so tiny and delicately made, with wonderful large blue eyes and chestnut wavy hair nearly to her waist, the tiny retroussé nose, and the only complexion I've ever seen that really was like a peach. Vivien adapted well to the structured life at the convent. However, even then she was displaying early signs of bipolar disorder and became prone to periods of depression. Meanwhile, Vivien took advantage of all the performing arts classes and auditions the school offered. Her early acting attempts included playing Mustard Seed in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Miranda in The Tempest. However, her performances weren't always successful. She struggled with a high-pitched voice and was poor at memorizing lines. In fact, she was so bad at remembering her lines that during one rehearsal, a frustrated fellow student attacked her and beat her with a candlestick when she stumbled one too many times. By 1927, when Vivien was 13, the Hartleys felt it was time for her to see a bit more of the world than the convent. They took her out of Sacred Heart and traveled abroad to further her education in Europe's finishing schools. Most young ladies of her class went to one finishing school, but Vivien attended several, studying French in Paris and Italian in San Remo. Her French tutor often took her to the best theaters in Paris. Afterwards, she went to Bavaria to learn German and immersed herself in the cultural scenes of Vienna and Salzburg. Throughout her life, Vivien valued her education, saying, "Apart from the fact that I learned to speak several languages more or less fluently and had an opportunity of studying diction in the theater in many countries, I met people of all types and nationalities. They gave me that flexibility of mind which is so necessary to an artist, and taught me, I hope, understanding. Through knowing them, I have always been able to recognize the characters I play and love them." The paradox of these finishing schools was that while they gave young women an unrivaled education, the only expected outcome for them was to learn to become a homemaker and attract the best possible husband. This was where Vivien differed from the other girls. She had ambitions to become an actress, not a housewife. Her time in Germany in particular was geared towards this, and it meant that, as she put it, being a girl, I had to learn what every housefrau should know, and I hated it. That was one of the things that helped me make up my mind to become an actress. Her desire to pursue acting became only stronger when she returned to London and saw her friend and former schoolmate, Maureen O'Sullivan, in a movie. Now she was even more determined to make it to the big screen herself. Fortunately, her parents supported her. At 18, she was accepted into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, one of the most prestigious schools in the world. But with that prestige came a punishing regime. Vivien recalled her struggles at the academy. In fact, all my reports from the academy were very bad. I did a play called Caesar's Wife by Somerset Maugham, and I remember the report saying, "Why are you so bad?" Her difficulty in focusing might have stemmed from something else, a blossoming romance. By late 1931, she had fallen in love. Vivien met Herbert Lee Holman, her future husband, at the South Devon Hunt Ball. While she wasn't looking to marry, such social events were designed to match young people from similar backgrounds. Holman, 13 years her senior at 31, was a well-established barrister and came from a family even more prestigious than the Hartleys. Their marriage took place in December 1932, a little over a year after they first met. Just like Scarlett O'Hara, Vivien quickly became a mother after her marriage, with her daughter Suzanne born on October 12, 1933. Being pregnant meant she had to pause her acting career, which disappointed her but delighted her husband. He didn't see acting as a fitting job for his wife and was happy she was assuming her so-called proper role as a wife and mother. However, Vivien soon made it clear she had other intentions. She said, "I was under 19 when I married, and not quite 20 when my daughter was born. I felt too young to be the mother of a child, and very lacking in the qualities of restfulness and serenity, which a mother should have." How many times since then Scarlett O'Hara's lines, speaking of her mother, have sprung to my mind. I always wanted to be like her, calm and kind. I certainly have turned out disappointingly. I loved my baby as every mother does, but with the clear-cut sincerity of youth, I realized that I could not abandon all thought of a career on the stage. Some force within myself would not be denied expression. I took the problem to my husband and asked his advice. We decided that I should continue my studies at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. We took a tiny house in Little Stanhope Street and got a good nanny for the baby. During her studies, Vivien landed a minor role in the film Things Are Looking Up. Her agent, John Glidden, suggested she change her name, finding Vivien Holman too mundane for an actress. He rejected her suggestion of April Morn, but accepted her alternative of adopting her husband's middle name, and this led to the creation of Vivien Leigh. Leigh's first important film role brought her great reviews and also opened doors in the world of theater. In 1935, she starred in The Mask of Virtue, and she would fondly remember. It was a romantic first night. The fact that I was young and unknown caught the imagination of the audience. The roar of applause when the final curtain fell told me that the miracle had happened. I had arrived. This performance became the real stepping stone to her future enormous fame. At the opening night of The Mask of Virtue, Alexander Korda, a director and producer, was in the audience. Glidden had previously tried to get Korda to sign Leigh for his production company, but Korda had refused. After seeing her performance, Korda changed his mind and offered her a film contract. It became clear that her future was in film. Another person wowed by Leigh's performance was Laurence Olivier, by that time already a well-known actor. He made a point to congratulate her and later described his first impression of her. Apart from her looks, which were magical, she possessed beautiful poise. Her neck looked almost too fragile to support her head and bore it with a sense of surprise, and something of the pride of the master juggler who can make a brilliant maneuver appear almost accidental. She also had something else, an attraction of the most perturbing nature I had ever encountered. It may have been the strangely touching spark of dignity in her that enslaved the ardent legion of her admirers. Olivier was clearly bowled over and encouraged her to audition for his next film, Fire Over England. Fire Over England was a big moment for Vivien. She played Cynthia, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth I, who falls in love with Michael Ingleby, played by Olivier. During filming, their on-screen romance turned into a real-life love affair. But this was despite the fact that they were both married. Clearly, their passion for one another caused them to forget any guilt or worries they had about hurting their respective spouses. In fact, they became notorious for their extremely public displays of affection, and these images were soon all over the newspapers. Olivier also wrote volumes of erotic letters to Leigh. Starting in 1936, he wrote her more than 200 letters during their long affair. Many were quite shocking for the time. In one, he wrote, "I woke up absolutely raging with desire for you, my love. Oh dear God, how I did want you. Perhaps you are stroking your darling self. If we loved each other only with our bodies, I suppose it would be all right. I love you with much more than that. I love you with, everything somehow, with a special kind of soul." In another letter, he told her he had spent the day lounging in bed wearing only her underwear. Olivier was also cautious about the damage being done to their reputations. In 1939, he wrote, "I have come to the conclusion you're very naughty. We are a popular scandal, or rather a public one. Therefore, it is only reasonably good taste to be as unobtrusive as possible. Can you dance and be gay and carry on like the gay, happy hypocrite days? No, my love, you cannot. Why? Because of your fame tripled with our situation, quadrupled with the fame thereof." It was perhaps the worst-kept secret in Hollywood through the late 1930s, but they would eventually be free to marry later on. Many of the letters also talk about Leigh's career and their shared anxiety that she would not get the big break she desired so much. While looking for something to read between takes during the shoot of Fire Over England, Vivien picked up the much-talked-about novel, Gone with the Wind, by Margaret Mitchell. She later said, "From the moment I read Gone with the Wind, I was fascinated by the lovely, wayward, tempestuous Scarlett. I felt that I loved and understood her, almost as though I had known her in the flesh. When I heard that the book was to be filmed in Hollywood early in 1939, I longed to play the part." After finishing the book, Vivien contacted her agent, insisting on a screen test for the role of Scarlett. She wasn't the only one with this ambition. Far from it. Dozens of actresses in America and beyond were eager for the part. However, Leigh was still relatively unknown and far from Hollywood, where the film was being made. When her agent's request reached the producer, David O. Selznick, he replied, "I have no enthusiasm for Vivien Leigh. Maybe I will have, but as yet have never even seen a photograph of her. I will be seeing Fire Over England shortly, at which time I will of course see Leigh." This wasn't exactly enthusiasm, but by Selznick's standards, it was a small window of opportunity for Leigh. While waiting for a chance to audition for Scarlett, Vivien played Ophelia opposite Olivier in Hamlet at the Old Vic Theatre in Elsinore Castle, Denmark. The castle's smaller space and stone walls helped project her often quiet voice. It was here that Olivier first noticed her mood swings, which were a sign of her as yet undiagnosed bipolar disorder. He recalled that just before the curtain rose, she suddenly started screaming at him without reason. As he tried to calm her, she became very quiet, almost as if she was in another world. Olivier was confused and didn't know if she could go on, but she continued with her role and she performed well on stage. Curiously, she didn't remember the incident the next day. It was clear Vivien was already struggling to balance her marriage and career. She and Olivier were living together, while both their spouses refused to grant divorces. The stress of this situation began to weigh on her, and her moods became volatile and unpredictable. When Olivier landed the role of Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, Vivien pushed to be cast as Kathy. However, director William Wyler offered her the part of Isabella instead. Leigh responded, "I'll play Kathy or I'll play nothing." Wyler thought she was being unreasonable and later recalled saying, "For a first part in Hollywood, you'll never get anything better than Isabella. I made this deathless prediction. She sure showed me." In 1937, Leigh took on a role as German spy Madeleine Goddard in Dark Journey, which did well with audiences and bumped her profile up once again. This led to her top billing in the somewhat forgotten film Storm in a Teacup. She then joined a star-studded cast in A Yank at Oxford in 1938. Playing opposite Robert Taylor and Lionel Barrymore, this film was another important step because it was her first to gain wide viewership in the United States. Audiences were lingering around for the film's credits to catch the name of the beautiful girl, and then filing out to check the fan magazines for more information about her. The studios were getting calls and fan mail inquiring about her next role. While they didn't have an answer yet, it was going to be a big one. After finishing St. Martin's Lane in 1938, Leigh flew to Hollywood to lobby for the role of Scarlett herself. The timing once again worked out as Olivier was also in Hollywood working on Wuthering Heights, and she wanted to have him around to keep her nerves in check. However, she didn't fully grasp that Hollywood's behavior standards were even stricter than London's. Although she could be near Olivier, she had to ensure their relationship remained totally platonic and highly secretive. America would not accept an adulteress as Scarlett O'Hara. Leigh might have hoped that being with Olivier would stabilize her moods, but her behavior had already become so unpredictable that Alexander Korda was threatening to drop her from his contract. This was a moment in her career when she almost dropped into obscurity, but instead the opposite happened. She arrived in Hollywood during the famous Search for Scarlett. Producer David O. Selznick had orchestrated a massive publicity stunt, encouraging many actresses to try out for the role. While debutantes from all over Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama auditioned, they were up against established stars like Lucille Ball and Bette Davis. What few of her rivals knew was that Leigh had a secret advantage. Her agent in America worked for the Myron Selznick Agency, owned by David's brother, and also represented Olivier. David had seen Leigh in A Yank at Oxford and thought she was a good actress but too British for the role. However, when Olivier introduced Leigh to Myron Selznick, Myron was bowled over. He knew she was the perfect fit for Scarlett. However, Myron still needed a way to capture David's interest, and he found his moment on December 9th, 1938. That day, David began filming the iconic burning of Atlanta scene. Myron approached with Vivien Leigh in tow, introducing her to David with the now legendary line, "Here, genius, meet your Scarlett O'Hara." The following day, David confided in his wife, writing, "Myron rolled in just exactly too late, arriving about a minute and a half after the last building had fallen and burned, and after the shorts were completed. With him were Larry Olivier and Vivien Leigh. Shh, she's the Scarlet Dark Horse, and looks damned good. Not for anybody's ears but your own. It's narrowed down to Paulette Goddard, Jean Arthur, Joan Bennett, and Vivien Leigh. We're making final tests this week. Once the director, George Cukor, reviewed her screen tests, he was convinced that Vivien Leigh was the right choice. Shortly afterward, Selznick announced that Scarlett O'Hara would be portrayed by an English actress completely unknown to most Americans. This decision surprised many, to say the least. This was already the most talked about picture in movie history after all. One major worry among industry insiders and fans alike was how Leigh would handle the Southern accent. In a rare interview from the time, which Selznick allowed, Leigh addressed this concern with typical elegance, saying, "As a matter of fact, we English are inclined to drop our R's and speak in a rather lackadaisical way, just as the Southerners do. But even so, any actress worth her salt should be able to handle any accent required." However, mastering the Southern drawl turned out to be one of Leigh's more minor challenges during the production of Gone with the Wind. Early into filming, George Cukor, who had a good rapport with Leigh and Olivia de Havilland, was fired and replaced by Victor Fleming at Selznick's behest. Cukor was sometimes called a women's director, while Fleming was very much one of the boys. He had better relationships with Clark Gable and Leslie Howard, and often argued heatedly with Vivien over scene interpretations. To get around Fleming's hot-headed and macho behavior, Leigh and de Havilland secretly consulted Cukor off-set for guidance on their roles. Leigh formed a much stronger bond with de Havilland than with Howard or Gable. In fact, she later spoke about how much she hated kissing Gable, saying that it made her nauseous. He had had all of his teeth removed following a gum infection in 1933, and in those days, dentures were notorious for the foul odors they produced. Gable had a very serious case of halitosis, which was not much aided by the huge number of cigarettes he smoked every day. As if proof of her acting chops were needed, she hid her disgust well enough for their kiss to become one of the most famous of all time. Interestingly, Clark Gable had been reluctant to join the film. Gary Cooper had declined the role of Rhett Butler, predicting, "Gone with the Wind is going to be the biggest flop in Hollywood history. I'm glad it'll be Clark Gable who's falling flat on his nose, not me." Gable thought Cooper had a point. It was, in fact, Carole Lombard who finally persuaded Gable to accept the part. Ultimately, all the challenges were worthwhile. Gone with the Wind has become one of the most important and famous films of all time. Along with Casablanca, you could argue that it is Hollywood. The most quoted line of all, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," is now known worldwide, and somehow says so much about the deeper meaning of the film in a few short words. Even though some snooty critics hated it, the film's massive popularity is easy to understand. Set against the backdrop of the Civil War and Reconstruction era in the South, Leigh's portrayal of the opulent yet crumbling Southern society belle is totally compelling. Scarlett O'Hara is both narcissistic and unlikable, but she possesses just enough vulnerability to win the viewer's heart. Leigh was perfect in the role, and it's unthinkable to imagine even great names like Paulette Goddard, Jean Arthur, and Joan Bennett being able to provide Scarlett with the same nuance and romantic intensity. Gone with the Wind swept up 10 Academy Awards at the Oscars in 1940, which was an even more remarkable feat given the strong contenders it was up against. The year 1939 is often talked of as one of the best years in Hollywood history, with other big releases including The Wizard of Oz and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And yet Gone with the Wind won a landslide. At only 26 years old, Leigh won the Best Actress Oscar for her role as Scarlett. It had been an incredible year for Leigh, and one which also gave her the other piece of news she'd been waiting for. Both Leigh's and Olivier's divorces were proceeding. However, the night of the ceremony was not a fairy tale. Olivier was bitter and resentful and set out to make the whole evening a nightmare for her. According to his son, Tarquin, Olivier almost lost control when they were returning home with the award, grabbing it from her and trying to hit her with it. He later admitted his tantrum, saying, "I was insane with jealousy." In the spring of 1940, Leigh and Olivier financed their own Broadway production of Romeo and Juliet. Some wondered why a 26-year-old woman with a child was playing a teenage lover opposite a 33-year-old Romeo. However, the real issue for New York audiences was their personal lives. The fact that they had both recently divorced and immediately become engaged to one another scandalized middle-class and moralizing New York society. The critics harshly reviewed the play, criticizing both the acting and staging. It closed early, which was a financial strain for both Leigh and Olivier. The short-lived joy post-Gone with the Wind was already disappearing from Leigh's life, and she was once again under mental strain. Also, the outbreak of war in Europe weighed heavily on their minds. Britain was under attack, and there was a pressure for them to return home and contribute to the war effort. Leigh told a reporter, "Everything seems so useless these days, and so unimportant. Even acting is inconsequential when one thinks of what is going on over there." They decided to stay in America to get married instead of returning to England. They finally received their respective divorces on the painful condition of giving up primary custody of their children. They married on August 31st, 1940, in a quiet ceremony at a luxury resort in Santa Barbara, California. After a box office failure with 21 Days Together, Leigh started her next major project in the fall of 1940, Waterloo Bridge. She played Myra, a dancer who becomes a prostitute after losing her job and believing her fiancé is dead. The film, like many of Leigh's, ends tragically with Myra taking her own life. Set in modern-day England and told in flashbacks, it was a propaganda film aimed to strengthen British-American relations as the United States hesitated to join the war. A critic from the New York Herald Tribune wrote, "It is apparent now, though, that her career is based on great talent and great beauty, rather than on the supposed break she got when she was picked to play the most popular heroine of our day. Actually, Gone with the Wind was extremely lucky to have her in it. For here is an actress who combines all of the sorcery of a vivid personality with brilliant acting execution." Leigh's next film with Olivier, That Hamilton Woman, was also designed to wrench American sympathy for Britain's war effort against Germany. The film tells the true story of the romance between British war hero, Admiral Horatio Nelson, and Lady Emma Hamilton during the Napoleonic Wars. Similar to Waterloo Bridge, it is narrated through flashbacks as the imprisoned and aged Hamilton recalls her life. The film was a hit not only with American audiences, but was also surprisingly popular in the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill pounced on its success by arranging a viewing for Allied leaders, including President Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. Churchill later sent a thank you note to the Oliviers, and they became lifelong friends following this. After the United States joined World War II following the Pearl Harbor attack in late 1941, the Oliviers returned to England and did not make any films during the war. They settled in a small town outside London, enjoying their time together when Olivier was not serving as a pilot with the British Navy. In 1943, Leigh went on a morale-boosting tour, performing for troops in North Africa. Although she was, of course, not in any immediate danger from combat, Vivien Leigh would end up being a casualty of World War II. During this tour, she contracted the disease that would eventually claim her life. To begin, it seemed like a cold, but soon worsened into a persistent cough and fever. The following year, doctors diagnosed her with tuberculosis and hospitalized her for nearly a month. Her condition worsened by her heavy smoking, which had reached 4 packs a day due to her anxiety. After the war ended in 1945, Leigh returned to the screen in Caesar and Cleopatra, opposite Claude Rains. Though she looked stunning as Cleopatra, her performance was poorly received, and the movie did not do well financially. During filming, Leigh discovered she was pregnant. In one scene, she had to run across a freshly polished floor. She did as she was asked, but suffered a severe fall, and this caused her to miscarry. This latest tragedy led to a period of deep depression. She became clinically depressed, spending her days crying and screaming, eventually having a complete breakdown. She attacked Olivier in a fit of rage, pounding him with her fists until collapsing at his feet. The news that she had contracted a fatal illness, followed by the loss of a baby, was simply too much for her already fragile mind to bear. From this point, she never fully recovered her mental well-being for any significant period of her remaining days. Olivier had become adept at reading his wife's moods. He noticed that when she became hyperactive and stopped sleeping, a breakdown was imminent. But he was at a loss when it came to a method of preventing them entirely. Hoping a stage schedule might be easier for her, Olivier arranged for Leigh to perform with him in The Skin of Our Teeth in London. This play, written by Thornton Wilder, depicted humanity's story across different eras, with the main setting in the modern 1940s. The play did well and was at least more successful than their previous attempt with Romeo and Juliet. In 1947, King George VI knighted Olivier in recognition of his stage work and contributions to the war effort. With this honor, Vivien became Lady Olivier. Her next role was in the adaptation of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Vivien Leigh portrayed the infamous Anna, a mistress who chooses suicide after losing her lover. The film was not successful commercially or critically, but shortly afterward, Vivien and Olivier embarked on a 6-month fundraising tour for London's Old Vic Theatre, where Olivier was a board member. He hoped that a new environment might benefit Leigh, who was showing signs of severe strain. Their tour to Australia and New Zealand began smoothly. Olivier performed Shakespeare, and together they starred in Richard Sheridan's The School for Scandal. The media particularly enjoyed Leigh's charming and graceful presence. However, as the tour progressed, Leigh began experiencing sleep issues and entered a manic phase. In Christchurch, New Zealand, she refused to perform. An argument ensued in which Olivier slapped her, leading her to retaliate and lash out before she managed to compose herself and proceed with the performance. This incident unfolded right in front of their entire theater company. Olivier later felt he had lost Vivien during their time in Australia, a sentiment that might hold some truth as Leigh became increasingly erratic, and she also began having an affair with actor Peter Finch. This relationship, which lasted several years, was so discreetly managed that Olivier, completely unaware of their liaison, still counted Finch among his closest friends for a long time. Eventually, the truth would come out in a rather bizarre way, but more on that later. Back in London, the Oliviers adapted their touring productions into a new show for the West End, which ran for only a few months. But soon after, Leigh was cast as another tragic Southern figure, Blanche Dubois, in the stage production of A Streetcar Named Desire. This was a second role that would define her, but in a very different way to Scarlett O'Hara. Leigh once again had an edge in securing the role thanks to her connections. She was acquainted with the show's producer, Irene Mayer-Selznick, who was David Selznick's daughter-in-law. Irene, having seen Leigh's performances in The School for Scandal and Antigone, was convinced she would excel as Blanche. And if that wasn't enough, her husband was hired to direct, which put him in the rare role of directing his own wife. The play's 1949 London debut drew large crowds but received lukewarm reviews from critics, largely due to the controversial content of the play. The themes of promiscuity, homosexuality, and implied rape attracted audiences, while the press had a field day moralizing about the scandalous nature of certain scenes. Critics, however, were again unimpressed with Leigh's soft voice, which some found difficult to understand. Others appreciated her understated delivery and wrote in to suggest that some of the aging London critics needed to turn up their hearing aids. The play was a popular success, running for over 300 performances. Meanwhile, the Broadway version was taking shape under the direction of Elia Kazan, who had decided on Marlon Brando for the role of Stanley Kowalski after directing him in Truckline Cafe. Brando's portrayal of the virile and sometimes violent Stanley was a perfect contrast with Blanche, a fragile and self-deluding relic of the Old South. As rehearsals progressed, it became clear that Brando's powerful portrayal shifted the play's focus from Blanche to Stanley. When the play opened in 1947, Brando's performance was pinned as a revolutionary moment in theater. Suddenly, theater-going audiences were subjected to a potent mix of raw sexuality and menacing aggression. By the time the stage performances wrapped up, Hollywood was ready to make a film adaptation. Leigh was chosen to reprise her role, but there was no question about who would play Stanley. It had to be Brando. While she got along well with Marlon Brando, she found director Elia Kazan a pain to work with. Kazan said of her, "She had a small talent, but as work progressed, I became full of admiration for the greatest determination to excel of any actress I've known. She'd have crawled over broken glass if she thought it would help her performance. In the scenes that counted, she excelled." Leigh found the filming exhausting and told a reporter, "I had 9 months in the theater of Blanche Dubois. Now she's in command of me." The only thing that prevented her from a complete breakdown was the fact that Olivier was also in Hollywood for one of his own films. He remembered, Vivien was too much affected by the parts she played. It had a great deal to do with playing Blanche Dubois being ill in the same way. Ultimately, Leigh's performance in A Streetcar Named Desire became the highlight of her career. Though the film was sanitized to meet Hays Code restrictions, it was still a huge success that stunned audiences and launched Brando's career to the stratosphere. Brando also thought Leigh was perfect for the role. He believed that her real-life struggles with mental illness made her a kindred spirit to Blanche. Brando wrote in his autobiography, "In many ways, she was Blanche. She was memorably beautiful, one of the great beauties of the screen, but she was also vulnerable, and her own life had been very much like that of Tennessee's wounded butterfly." She and Brando had in fact struck up a great friendship. Brando's unusual mind and virile independence was attractive to her. When they met, he asked her, "Why do you always wear scent?" "Because I like to smell nice. Don't you?" Vivien replied. "Me," he said, "I just wash. In fact, I don't even get in the bath. I just throw a gob of spit in the air and run under it." This had her laughing, and when he rolled out his pitch-perfect imitation of Olivier, she was almost hysterical. But Brando could see something wasn't right. Her mind began to wobble and her sense of self became vague, Brando said. Like Blanche, she slept with almost everybody and was beginning to dissolve mentally and to fray at the ends physically. Brando also said, "I might have given her a tumble if it hadn't been for Larry Olivier. I'm sure he knew she was playing around, but like a lot of husbands I've known, he pretended not to see it." While her attraction to Brando would have been wholly understandable, some of her other lovers were not. She allegedly picked up a gigolo named Scotty Bowers from a gas station and brought him back to director George Cukor's house. "We had to be careful," Bowers later recounted. "George was a light sleeper. The slightest noise would wake him. Vivien and I looked at one another, giggled quietly, and tried to make as few sounds as possible as we began to passionately make out." When he woke up, he saw Vivien staring in her mirror, dead-eyed and refusing to acknowledge him. Then she locked herself in her bathroom and screamed at him to leave. He tried to reassure her through the door, and she burst out sobbing, saying, "Oh, darling, darling boy, I'm sorry. Can you come around again tonight?" In 1951, Leigh and Olivier returned to the stage, playing the title roles in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and George Bernard Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra. This time they tried something different. Instead of finishing one play before starting the next, they performed both plays on alternate nights. This approach was successful and both productions received rave reviews. After a successful run in London, they took both plays to Broadway in 1952. Most of the reviews were positive, but Kenneth Tynan was a harsh critic of Vivien Leigh as Cleopatra. He not only criticized her performance, but suggested it was hurting Olivier's career to be playing alongside such a poor actress. Tynan seemed to enjoy attacking Leigh with his harsh reviews, which deeply affected her and worsened her depression. About her role in Titus Andronicus, he said she receives the news that she is about to be ravished on her husband's corpse with little more than the mild annoyance of one who would have preferred foam rubber. These comments were almost too much for Leigh to bear. She became fixated on Tynan's criticisms, disregarding the positive feedback from other critics. She pushed herself harder, never feeling she was good enough. By the time Caesar and Cleopatra closed in late 1952, she was completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. Tynan was unrelenting and making good business through berating the fragile Leigh in his columns. In a 1983 interview after Tynan's death, his widow Emily called his attacks on Leigh completely unnecessary. Olivier believed it was from jealousy, and later on, Tynan had his own story to tell. Prior to their sour media relationship, Tynan and his wife had been invited to Notley to stay with Olivier and Leigh. Tynan claimed that he woke up in the middle of the night to see a figure standing over his bed. It was Vivien Leigh, and she was naked under her open peignoir. Tynan rejected her when she tried to get into his bed, so he remembered it, out of his respect for his idol, Olivier. So Leigh turned around and got into bed with his wife, Emily, instead, at which point Tynan decided to leave the room and sleep somewhere else. Whatever the truth, Tynan was unwilling to let the matter rest, and devoted much of his energy to destroying her in the press in the later years. Notley was very active, especially when Leigh was in a manic phase. She would stay up all night and not sleep for days on end, and had particular enthusiasm for receiving guests in these phases. Guests such as Godfrey Wynne, Orson Welles, and Rex Harrison would come to stay and be expected to stay up all night banqueting with Leigh, who was also drinking pretty heavily. These episodes also made her easily agitated, and while her moods were under better control when guests were around, she could be explosive in her anger against Olivier. Olivier pleaded with her to slow down and rest, but she seemingly had energy to burn. On one occasion, quite literally. Actress Juliette Mills remembered once visiting Notley and hearing the Oliviers engaged in a furious argument during the night. The next thing she knew, there was smoke pouring under her bedroom door, as Vivien had set her own bed on fire. She could be cruel to Olivier, who doted on her and was seemingly completely in love. She tried to push him away and said he was more like a brother to her, but she still had a strong sexual attraction to him, making the relationship confusing and exhausting for Olivier. His only escape was to throw himself deeper into his work, and his absences made life even harder for his wife. Other guests were wholly unsympathetic to her plight. In the mid-1950s, Olivier's friend, Noel Coward, said, "What has driven her round the bend again is the demon alcohol. I suspect there is far less genuine mental instability about it than most people seem to think. She has always been spoiled, and when she fails to get her own way, she takes to the bottle and goes berserk. Personally, I think that if Larry had turned sharply on Vivien years ago and given her a clip in the chops, he would have been spared a mint of trouble." However, by the time he made these unpleasant remarks, she had already given up alcohol and cigarettes in an attempt to cure her problems, but to no avail. One idea they had was to go away somewhere and make a film together. The perfect opportunity arose with Elephant Walk, which would be set in Ceylon, nowadays known as Sri Lanka. However, Olivier pulled out due to his other commitments, leaving Leigh to continue on alone. To remedy this, she requested that Olivier be replaced by her lover, Peter Finch. Finch was Olivier's protege and married to a ballerina, so they already knew one another. She called him at 2 a.m. and insisted on coming over immediately to deliver the screenplay, which she did wearing a mink coat with nothing underneath. This was just after she had discovered Olivier's affair with 22-year-old Dorothy Tutton. Finch agreed to take on the role. Filming in Ceylon was enough of an ordeal, and Leigh began to self-medicate with alcohol and wander about through the night due to her chronic insomnia. She also tried to seduce co-star Dana Andrews, and apparently other members of the crew. The producer cabled Olivier, and he flew out to Ceylon immediately, where she sobbingly confessed to having an affair with Finch. Olivier was distressed by this news, and although he did his best to soothe his wife's frayed state of mind, he was obliged to depart. At this point, she began to show signs of psychosis, and would run after Finch, calling out Larry to him, as she grieved for the absent Olivier. By now, she was hallucinating and in serious trouble, so she was put on a flight to Hollywood where the shoot would continue on a soundstage. During the flight, she began screaming that the wing was on fire, and began beating the window with her fist trying to get out of the plane. She tore off her clothes and fought and scratched at anyone who tried to restrain her, until she was finally exhausted and sobbing. Once in Hollywood, it was decided she could not continue with Elephant Walk, and she was replaced by Elizabeth Taylor. When the Oliviers arrived at Croydon Airport, having flown back from Hollywood, a subdued Vivien said to her husband, "We're really home, aren't we?" However, the truth was that Olivier was not driving her home, but to Nathurn Asylum in Surrey. The 1950s was a very long way from the doctrines of mental health care that we might expect today. Leigh was subjected to freezing cold ice baths, sleeping in wet sheets, heavy and disorienting drugs, and worst of all, electroconvulsive therapy. She was routinely strapped down and had blocks placed between her teeth to bite on as the pain of the shock was pulsed through her temples. The treatment left burn marks and permanent scars, as well as causing her hair to fall out. On leaving, she vowed never to return to such a place again, no matter what. By 1953, Leigh had recovered enough to return to the stage. She starred with Olivier in The Sleeping Prince. After a moderately successful run, they performed together at Stratford-upon-Avon in 1953. Returning to Shakespeare, they starred in Twelfth Night, Macbeth, and Titus Andronicus. Audiences were excited to see them on stage again, and this led to sold-out shows. Leigh enjoyed the success, although she had an explosive and often negative working relationship with director John Gielgud. In 1955's The Deep Blue Sea, she acted alongside Kenneth More, who agreed with critics that their on-screen chemistry was lacking. Noel Coward then cast Leigh in the TV movie South Sea Bubble. But her work was interrupted when she became pregnant at 43. It seemed like her dream of being a mother was about to be realized. However, such a late pregnancy carried inevitable risks, and she miscarried, which sent her into another downward spiral. The child may have been Peter Finch's. Olivier was angry with his friend Finch for taking advantage of his wife's condition. His response was to invite Finch to dinner at Notley, their stately home. A dinner table conversation was polite between the three of them. But when Vivien went to make coffee, Olivier invited Finch into his library and poured him a drink. One look at Olivier's stern face, and Finch knew what was coming. However, he was unable to stop himself from bursting out laughing at the situation. Apparently, it was infectious, and Olivier was also splitting his sides soon enough. Leigh had also figured out what must be going on, so she decided to up the ante. She burst into the library and said, "Will one of you come to bed with me now?" This cut the laughter, especially from Olivier. He responded by saying, "You've got to choose." Leigh stared long and hard at her lover Finch. Olivier felt her slipping away, but then she said, "Darling, his fingernails, they're dirty." This was all Finch needed to hear. Now somber, he gathered his things and left, barely saying another word. It was the last time they saw him. Leigh's battle with bipolar disorder led to behavior that some biographers unjustly labeled as nymphomania. Despite rumors claiming she indiscriminately sought out cab drivers and workmen for casual sex, these stories were sensationalized to sell papers. While she did have several affairs, she was selective about her partners. However, selective or not, her marriage to Olivier could not survive. He had always described his relationship with Leigh as the real thing and true love. But her state of mind had pushed him away, and he had fallen in love with actress Joan Plowright. Upon hearing the news, Vivien attacked Olivier with a wet towel and he threw her across the room. Leigh was entering another dark phase, and life was becoming a burden. She said, "A lucky thing Eva Peron was. She died at 32. I'm already 45. Scorpios burn themselves out and eat themselves up, and they are careless about themselves, like me. I swing between happiness and misery and I cry easily. I am a mixture of my mother's determination and my father's optimism. I am part prude and part nonconformist, and I say what I think and don't dissemble. I am a mixture of French, Irish, and Yorkshire, and perhaps that's what it all is." In 1958, she began a relationship with actor Jack Merivale. Olivier, exhausted from the emotional toll of caring for her, welcomed Merivale's involvement after he reached out to Olivier and promised to look after Leigh. Their divorce in 1960 was undoubtedly painful for Olivier, but he found some peace in it. He later said, "Throughout her possession by that uncannily evil monster, manic depression, with its deadly, ever-tightening spirals, she retained her own individual canniness, an ability to disguise her true mental condition from almost all except me, for whom she could hardly be expected to take the trouble." Leigh confessed that she continued to love Olivier, saying, "I would rather have lived a short life with Larry than face a long one without him." In the days leading up to Olivier's death in 1989, he watched one of the many films featuring him opposite Leigh and was moved to tears, simply stating, This was love." The period following her separation was fraught with increasingly erratic behavior. She once rented a car and demanded it be repainted because she was unhappy with its color. She also insisted on bringing her priceless Renoir and Picasso paintings along with her whenever she traveled. However, Merivale was actually a stabilizing influence on Leigh, and in 1959 she felt able to work again. She starred in Noel Coward's comedy, Look After Lulu. Critics were enthusiastic about the production and her performance. There was, it seemed, potential for a resurgence in her career, yet the same year her dear friend Kay Kendall passed away at the age of 33, and this was another event which rocked her mental health. In July 1961, she had rallied, and Merivale and Leigh went on a year-long global tour, with performances from Australia to South America. Leigh thrilled audiences worldwide, and this was the first time she had ventured on stage without Olivier's support. Her career hit another high point in 1963 when she won a Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical for her role in Tovarich. She won this award while performing under extraordinary circumstances, often heavily sedated after frequent incidents of terrifying manic episodes that turned her violent and unstable. She also took on lead roles in The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone in 1961 and Ship of Fools in 1965. During the latter film, she struck co-star Lee Marvin with a high-heeled shoe which left him with a permanent scar. In May 1967, during the filming of A Delicate Balance, Lee's physical health deteriorated as she experienced coughing fits and fevers, symptoms of her recurring tuberculosis. She had known since her diagnosis that she would likely eventually be consumed by the disease. It was just a matter of time. Despite doctors' advice to hospitalize, she chose to recover at home, surrounded by the comfort of her luxurious bedroom. She wrote letters and welcomed visits from friends. For a while, she seemed to be improving. However, on the night of July 7th, 1967, Mary Vale discovered her collapse near their bed. Attempts to revive her were futile. She had succumbed to the illness, unable to clear the fluid in her lungs. She had been trying to make it to her bathroom, the door of which was humbly propped open by one of her Best Actress Oscars. But she never made it. She was just 53 years old. Mary Vale immediately called their family doctor and a few close friends to be with him. The doctor pronounced Leigh dead, and Mary Vale gently laid her body back in bed. When morning came, he called Olivier, who was himself in hospital undergoing treatment for prostate cancer. Olivier left his own sickbed and went straight to the house. He later wrote about that night, "I stood and prayed for forgiveness for all the evils that had sprung up between us. It has always been impossible for me not to believe that I was somehow the cause of Vivien's disturbances." Mary Vale had also contacted Leigh's mother and daughter. Her father had passed away 8 years earlier. The two women flew to Hollywood to identify the body and start making funeral arrangements. A requiem mass was held at St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church on July 12th at 10 in the morning. Tragically, Cecil Tennant, Vivien's agent, died in a car accident on his way home from her funeral. Spookily, she used to tell Tennant, "I will take you with me when I go." After the mass, Leigh's body was taken to the chapel of Golders Green Crematorium in London. She lay in state surrounded by white roses from her garden. On August 15th, a large memorial service took place at St. Martin-in-the-Fields Church in Trafalgar Square. British actor Emlyn Williams read from John Donne's Of the Progress of the Soul after a brief prayer service. On October 8th, Mary Vale, Holman, her mother, and her daughter gathered to scatter her ashes on the surface of a small lake at her country estate, Tickeridge Mill, near Blackboys in East Sussex. In her will, she left a particularly personal gift, her corneas, which she hoped could be used to give someone else sight. The very eyes that once gazed into Rhett's up on the silver screen many years before. Unfortunately, due to her tuberculosis, they couldn't be used. Leigh's life was much more than her struggles with mental illness. She was a truly extraordinary woman. She spoke at least 3 languages fluently, adored Siamese cats, and had a photographic memory. And all of this was achieved in the face of devastating physical and mental illness, showing the strength she had within. She played 2 very different roles which have come to define Hollywood itself, and she burned very brightly wherever she appeared. Her suffering may have been terrible, but the legacy she left was unique and exceptional. If you'd like more interesting stories from Hollywood's past, why not check out our Patreon and YouTube membership tiers, which are linked in the description. You can sign up for our weekly Hollywood Histories essays, which are about some of the more obscure and fascinating parts of Hollywood. Otherwise, check out our online store where we have a range of exclusive and very cool-looking Hollywood-themed shirts, just in time for Christmas. Or simply feel free to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for listening. Sweet dreams.